Hi guys, I'm a bit late getting this video done, so I'll jump right into it with an excerpt from chapter 1 of my new novel, The Wild East, the book I wrote 2 weeks ago for Author vs. AI. The sheriff tilted back his wide-brimmed hat and scratched at his hairline, which was itchy with dried sweat. They had been waiting here under the hot sun for the past hour or so, and he was starting to feel as restless as their horses. But he couldn't paw at the ground or lip the dried grass like they could. He had to set an example for his men. Or rather, they had to set an example. His eye caught the mayor's gaze, and the two men nodded slightly at each other. They had put everything on the line with this gambit, and no amount of blood spilled would ever make right again what had been taken from them. But they would carry on. That was the law of this lawless land. They would carry on for as long as they had breath left to carry anything at all. His horse's ears pricked up and swung toward a sound he couldn't hear. But suddenly all the horses were on alert, and he knew that it was time. "Get ready," he said quietly, barely louder than the breeze or the gurgle of the slight stream behind them. "When they pass us by, then we shoot." Events didn't always play out as planned. Like when he had been ambushed 20 years ago on his way to town and left with nothing but his life in the shirt on his back. Or when Marie died in childbirth with their third baby, and he had been forced to raise a young son and daughter on his own. Plans changed. Intentions couldn't be relied on, good or not. And hell was always waiting right around the corner. They were hidden behind an outcropping of rock and downwind from the approaching horses. From the sounds of it and their reconnaissance, he dared not peek. He estimated perhaps 10 men. He had just as many next to him, plus 3 more, a baker's dozen. His rifle was already sitting easy in his hands, and he held it loosely pointed at the ground. The thumping of hooves on the dusty ground grew louder until it became a steady drumming. Any second, any second. Movement in front of them, a swirl of dust and hooves and flapping coats. "Now!" he shouted, and they surged forward as one, spreading out to half circle the group so they wouldn't be in each other's line of fire. The guns boomed, the enemy riders pulling up their mounts and falling to the ground, and it was all over in a matter of seconds. There had been a lot of dust kicked up in the scuffle, but when it started to settle as they held the group at gunpoint, the sheriff's eyes darted from one man to the next. Some were still mounted and had their hands in the air to show they weren't drawing their weapons, which would be a suicidal move. They were badly outgunned at this point, with half their number on the ground, either wounded or dead. While the rest looked flea-bitten and tough as nails, not a single one of the outlaws was the man he was looking for. "Where is he?" The mayor voiced the question he could not. He had no answer to give the man. This was supposed to be the end of the years-long turf war, but instead it was just a momentary battle and not even the one they had prepared for. Just as he was opening his mouth to say they should bring the men back to the jail in town and ask them a few questions, that's when he got the breath knocked out of him. The ground rushed up to meet him, and he barely got his hands up to protect his head from smacking against the churned-up land. Pain hit a second later. "Damn," he said. Or perhaps he only thought the word, since he didn't seem to have breath left to speak. The boom of rifles filled his ears, and this time they weren't his or his men. His head was tilted so he could look back along the path, but he couldn't seem to move much. It hurt too much to do so. His horse had gotten spooked and cantered off, which was probably a good thing. He wouldn't get trampled by his own mount. But there were other panicked animals milling around, and he idly wondered if this was how it was going to end for him, a hoof to the noggin, an ignoble death for someone who was just trying to keep his town safe from outlaws. A dust cloud was coming closer, and from the thunder against his ear it sounded like a whole herd of horses was on its way. He couldn't see much except that the lead rider wore all black, a sign of good luck in his home country, but it meant something else here. And he knew who that man was, the very man he'd hoped to ambush here, but he had been outsmarted again. He watched the horses stop shy of his prone body. The man in black dismounted and strode over. His clothes weren't very black anymore, but more gray from road dust. Black wasn't a good color for long-term wear on the trail. A boot kicked the sheriff's shoulder in a not-so-gentle manner, and he yelped in pain as he was unceremoniously unceremoniously rolled over without his willpower. He glanced down and saw that there were splatters of red on his white shirt, and it was at that moment that he first realized he had been shot. He couldn't move, and spots danced around the edges of his line of vision as the man bent over him. The outlaw's beard and mustache were slick with grease, and his skin was creased with lines of dirt. "Sheriff Shiro," he drawled, "I do believe you're a little ways distant from your jurisdiction." Shiro opened his mouth to speak, but it took 2 tries to make the words come. There was a numbness spreading over his body, and while the dulling of pain was welcome, he was afraid that it wasn't a good sign overall for his continued time on this earth. "Lucas Kane," he finally spat out. "The only way you could beat me is by shooting me in the back. Guess you were too scared to face me." Lucas stepped back. The grin spreading across his face was one that would make ladies recoil, and the sight of his blackened teeth was enough to turn even the strongest stomach. "Fear ain't nothing," he said, and cocked his pistol. "At least I'm still breathing." Here's another cliffhanger. Does Shiro survive, or is he a goner? This past week's book shifted gears again, and I'll tell you more info about that shortly. I'm recording these videos as fast as I can talk, which my kids might say is pretty damn fast. Stay tuned.